Well, good morning, everybody. I think we're at our starting time. And once again, if anyone is new to any of my classes, let me say that in order to be able to cover all that I want to cover in a delimited amount of time, I'll read my remarks and hopefully finish them within about 20 minutes or so. And then somewhat differently than my other classes, I've had a copy of a very recent New York Times article distributed, which when I finish my remarks, I'll ask you quickly to read. It should take you just a very few minutes. And that will relate very much to the substance of our discussion, and it'll be in the nature of a kind of applied exercise, the nature of which I'll explain to you when we get to that point. So what I want to try to do is explain the nature of interventionism, the scope of it, how much is going on, what is its cost, what are its essential consequences. Well, I conceive of interventionism as any and all acts of government that both represent the initiation of physical force and at the same time stop short of imposing an all-round socialist economic system in which production characteristically takes place at the initiative of the government. In contrast to socialism, interventionism is a system in which production continues to take place characteristically at the initiative of private individuals and is motivated by the desire to earn private profit. Interventionism exists in the framework of a market economy, though, as von Mises puts it, such a market economy is a, quote, hampered market economy, unquote. That's the nature of interventionism, a hampered market economy. Now, many countries often thought to be socialist, such as Sweden, Israel, and Great Britain under the old Labour Party, should be, I believe, thought of as hampered market economies instead. And that's because production in those countries characteristically takes place or took place at private initiative and is motivated by private profit. The effect of the very extensive interventionism in those countries has been to prevent people from doing many things they otherwise would have done, many things, and to compel them to do many things they otherwise would not have done had they not been compelled to do them. But within those confines, matters pertaining to production are characteristically still decided by private individuals who are motivated by the prospect of making profits and avoiding losses. Thus, it is still private initiative motivated by private profit that animates and drives the economy of those countries. The fact that the ruling political party in such countries may call itself socialist and support the philosophy of socialism is not sufficient to make them socialist countries in fact. The only genuinely socialist countries that have existed have been Soviet Russia and its East European satellites, Communist China and its satellites, Cuba, and also, very importantly, Nazi Germany. Mises explains that Nazi Germany was a socialist state by virtue of the existence of all-round price controls and the consequent shortages they create. In response to the existence of shortages and the economic chaos that accompanies them, the government takes control of all fundamental decisions concerning production, such as what is produced, in what quantities, by what methods, and who is to get the resulting product. Mises calls such socialism on the German or Nazi pattern to distinguish it from the obvious socialism of the Soviets, in which all means of production are openly nationalized, and which he calls socialism on the Russian or Bolshevik pattern. Socialism on the German pattern is deceptive and is often mistakenly characterized as capitalism because it maintains the outward guise and appearance of private ownership of the means of production and thus of capitalism. However, under German-style socialism, private ownership exists in name only. The power to make all the substantive decisions that constitutes the essence of ownership is in the hands of the government and is exercised by the government. Socialism on the German or Nazi pattern is de facto socialism. Well, hopefully the distinction between interventionism and socialism is now clear. However, it is also necessary to distinguish interventionism from proper, legitimate government action, which does not represent interventionism. All government action, good and bad, represents the use of physical force. There is a saying in Latin, nulle lega sine poena, which means in translation, no law without punishment. Every law, edict, ruling, decree, or regulation that a government issues is backed by the threat of physical force, even to the point of killing whoever does not obey it. And this applies to the most minor offenses, such as the refusal to wear a seatbelt or pay a parking ticket. First may come reminder letters, increasingly less polite, asking for payment of the initial fine. If they are ignored, then may come greater fines. Beyond the fines comes the threat of arrest and imprisonment. And if, when the officers come to make the arrest, one resists, then whatever force is required to overcome one's resistance will be applied, including the use of firearms and sharpshooters. Now, by no means is it the case that all such instances are wrong, unreasonable, or in any way objectionable. There are murderers, muggers, rapists, robbers, and con men of various types, and the activity of these last is tantamount to robbery. The deeds of all these categories of people represent the use of physical force in that they are physically doing something, they constitute physically doing something to or with the person or property of another against his or her will. More than that, such actions represent the initiation of physical force. Now, when the government uses force against such perpetrators, its actions represent the use of force in defense or retaliation on behalf of innocent victims. The government's use of force in such cases, provided it is not excessive, is entirely appropriate. In essence, it's the same as the physical force used by the sheriffs and United States Marshals depicted in old Western movies against bank robbers, cattle rustlers, and so on. The difference between the use of physical force in defense or retaliation and the initiation of physical force is the essential difference between the guys in the white hats and the guys in the black hats in those Western movies. It's the difference between the physical force used by a bank robber and the bank guard, the physical force used by a kidnapper and the physical force used by the rescuers of the kidnapper's victim. Exactly the same point applies to a country's armed forces. They are a legitimate use of force insofar as they are used in defense and retaliation against foreign aggression. Of course, they are illegitimate insofar as they themselves are used in aggression against other countries. The government's use of defensive and retaliatory force does not represent interventionism. In such cases, the government is simply doing its entirely proper, strictly limited job of protecting individual rights from the initiation of physical force. The concept of interventionism applies only to instances in which the government uses physical force not in a defensive or retaliatory capacity, but as an aggressor. That is, uses physical force against people who have not initiated its use. And this is what the government does every time it forbids a voluntary contractual relationship, certainly between consenting adults, such as the offer and acceptance of a price or wage or products or working conditions that the parties judge to be in their respective self-interest to offer and accept. Likewise, the government initiates the use of physical force whenever it compels one man to pay any part of his wealth or income against his will for the benefit or support of another, as is the case in the financing of public welfare, public housing, public education, or for some alleged benefit to himself that he prefers not to pay for, such as a future Social Security or Medicare benefit. So much for the nature of interventionism. The policy of the strict avoidance of interventionism is the policy of laissez-faire, which very simply is to be understood as if it, that is the action or situation or whatever, does not represent the initiation of physical force, the government must leave it alone, i.e. not intervene. Well, now we must turn to the question of precisely what is the scope of interventionism. Point 2. This is a question that is very closely related to the further question of what is its cost. One method of judging the scope of interventionism, at least as a first approximation, is to consider the number of federal cabinet departments and the various alphabet agencies that now exist, and judge how many of them would remain and to what extent if the guiding principle were enacted that the government is not to initiate the use of physical force and is thus to end all of its intervention, i.e. if the guiding principle were laissez-faire. At present, there are 14 cabinet departments: agriculture, commerce, defense, education, energy, health and human services, housing and urban development, interior, justice, labor, state, transportation, treasury, and veterans affairs, and demands to have still more. I will not attempt anything approaching a full enumeration of the alphabet agencies. Among the best known are the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, FRB, Federal Reserve Board, FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, FDA, Food and Drug Administration, SEC, CFTC, NLRB, FTC, FCC, FERC, FAA, CAA, INS, OHSA, CPSC, NHTSA, EEOC, BATF, DEA, NIH, NASA, CIA, and FBI. And there's more, I'm sure we could add to the list. Now, if the government were restricted to the use of force only in defense or retaliation, the only cabinet departments that would remain would be justice, to prosecute acts of initiation of force across state lines, and possible acts of aggression by state governments. Defense, state, and treasury. All others would be eliminated. This would essentially reduce the number of cabinet departments to the original 5 that existed under George Washington. The Department of Defense incorporates what were then, and until as recently as 1948, the separate departments of War and Navy. Of course, not even these departments would continue as they are presently constituted. For example, the Justice Department would certainly lose its antitrust division, which would be closed. And the Treasury Department would lose the IRS, which would also be closed. The Department of Defense would be scaled back to defending only the territory of the United States and abandon the mission of acting as global policemen. The State Department would cease to grant foreign aid. As for the alphabet agencies, probably only the FBI would survive, not even that necessarily. And its area of investigation would be limited exclusively to acts entailing the initiation of physical force across state lines or against the United States. The scope and also the cost of interventionism can be judged by considering the current budget of the federal government and the magnitude and makeup of the expenditures of the state and local governments. As of January of this year at least, the federal budget for the current fiscal year of 2001 projected total federal outlays of $1,856 billion. Of that sum, only $299 billion appear under the heading National Defense, $29 billion under the heading Administration of Justice, and $17 billion under the heading General Government, which last includes such things as financing the White House, Congress, and the federal judiciary. For the reasons explained, of course, even these sums would be substantially less under a policy of strict laissez-faire and non-aggression than those presently projected. But even taking them at their present levels, it is clear that the overwhelming bulk of government spending, i.e., all but the $345 billion that comes under these 3 headings combined, all but $345 billion out of the $1,856 billion overall total is spending that represents government intervention, spending that would not exist under laissez-faire. Such spending at the federal level is clearly in excess of 80%. And when all things are considered, may well be close to or even greater than 90% of total federal spending. The elimination of this spending would make possible the abolition of the personal and corporate income taxes and the inheritance and capital gains taxes, along with the repeal of the special taxes to pay for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The situation is essentially the same with respect to the spending of state and local governments. In the first quarter of this year, state and local government spending, according to statistics published by the government's own Bureau of Economic Analysis, was running at an annual rate of $1,231.7 billion. Of this sum, no more than 15 to 20% is classified under the heading of public order or public safety. And I'm sure if we examined that category in detail, we would get substantially less than 15% as genuinely going for defense against the initiation of force. Well, since the states and localities currently receive almost $260 billion of the funds they expend from the federal government, and that sum is already included under federal spending, the total of government spending going to individuals and businesses reportedly comes to $2,829 billion. That's the overall total, $2,829 billion. To place this sum in perspective, it should be compared with the total of incomes earned in the economic system, i.e. so-called national income, which is reported as currently running at an annual rate of $8,165 billion. And this figure, the national income figure, it should be noted, is substantially inflated by so-called imputations, and that is monetary allowances for economic activity that does not in fact represent the actual earning of money. One example is the imputation for the net rental income allegedly received by homeowners in renting their homes to themselves. An absolute fiction. Well, now, removing all of the imputations, and there are some massive ones, especially in connection with interest income, removing these imputations would reduce national income substantially, probably by at least 10%, which would put it at approximately $7,350 billion. And indeed, this figure must be further substantially reduced. National income currently includes approximately $900 billion of wages and salaries paid to government employees. To appraise the impact of government spending on the taxpayers, who must pay for it, most of those wages and salaries must be deducted from the reported national income figure. All of them except the portion which itself is paid in taxes, which is probably no more than a third at the utmost. Thus, if we have an adjusted national income, we now have an adjusted national income figure of roughly $6,750 billion, which reflects the subtraction of $600 billion of after-tax wage payments to government employees. It is this figure against which the impact of $2,829 billion of government spending must be judged, because that's the income, the true adjusted income of the taxpayers who are paying for the government spending. And as a percentage of this figure, government spending amounts to approximately 42%. So the burden of government spending on the incomes of the taxpayers, eliminating imputations, is really on the order of 42%. But this is by no means the full story concerning the cost of interventionism. This is merely a measure of the direct cost of government spending. What the government does with the money it spends can impose and does impose enormous additional costs. For example, this year's federal budget lists an expenditure of $27 billion under the heading of natural resources and the environment. This, of course, includes the budget of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is charged with enforcing and applying existing environmental legislation and enacting all manner of new and additional regulations authorized by the legislation under which it operates. This agency is the one that decides what air and water quality standards must be met and which species are endangered. Its use of whatever billions have been budgeted for it over the years has undoubtedly served to impose many hundreds of billions, possibly several trillions of additional costs on businesses and consumers across the country. Indeed, such indirect costs should be assumed to be the result of all of the regulatory agencies. As the result of OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, CPSC, Consumer Product Safety Commission, and NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Agency, the prices of many consumers' goods have been substantially increased in order to comply with government-mandated safety requirements. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, substantially adds to the costs of new drugs to whatever extent it unnecessarily delays their introduction. And indeed, it causes people to suffer and die unnecessarily by preventing the introduction of drugs that have already proved their value for many years in other countries. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, along with the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, routinely prevents business firms from achieving greater economies by preventing them from carrying out mergers that would reduce costs and thus prices. The NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, routinely drives up business costs and prices by compelling collective bargaining with labor unions, and thus the payment of union scales and acceptance of union work rules. At the same time, of course, it adds to unemployment. Such extra costs are in the very nature of interventionism. As we've seen, to the extent that there is interventionism, individuals are prohibited from taking peaceful actions they judge to be in their interest, and or are compelled to take actions they judge to be against their interest. A leading category of actions that individuals judge to be in their interest are those that make it possible for them to achieve better results and lower costs. The actions they seek to avoid are those that will cause them to achieve poorer results and incur higher costs. By preventing individuals from doing what is in their interest to do and compelling them to do what is against their interest to do, it is not surprising that interventionism succeeds in driving up costs and holding back improvement. Now, I believe that the growing cost of interventionism is what is responsible for the fact that apart from the contribution made by women working more, real family income for most people in the United States has been stationary or even declining over the last 30 years or more, even including most of the recent boom years. And there was another Times article not too long ago called "The Tide is Not Lifting Everyone." Now, a major vice of interventionism is that it tends to grow. In the words of von Mises, prior intervention breeds later intervention. For example, let's assume the government imposes rent controls. The result is that private investors don't want to build rental housing because it isn't profitable. Instead of repealing the rent controls, the government goes on to build public housing, claiming that the free market has failed. You could substitute the nationalization of the passenger railroads for public housing. First, the government regulates the rates of the railways, compels them to deal with the railway brotherhood unions so they can't make a profit, and then what's the solution? The government has to nationalize the passenger railroads. Or you could substitute privately owned electric utilities, same story. Or the government imposes minimum wage and pro-union legislation, thereby compulsorily pricing workers out of the market and into unemployment. Then the complaint is made that capitalism suffers from an inherent problem of unemployment, necessitating a system of public welfare. Well, in addition to their economic cost, it should be realized that many, if not all of the administrative agencies routinely violate basic protections of Anglo-Saxon law. This is because they combine within themselves the role of legislator, prosecutor, and judge and jury. The regulations they enact take effect upon publication in the Federal Register, whereupon they are added to the Code of Federal Regulations, which now contains several tens of thousands of pages. It's longer even than my book. The regulations have the force of law and are often unintelligible, vague, arbitrary, or contradictory. Now, it would be very valuable at some point for a volume, or perhaps better, a series of volumes to be written someday, perhaps titled Alphabet Soup, or The Cost and Consequences of Federal Regulations, which would detail the harm done by each and every government regulatory agency and each and every improper cabinet department. Naturally, the same thing would have to be done at the level of state and local governments. Such a project should, of course, also deal with the intellectual foundations of interventionism. That is, the ideas and arguments, the doctrines and theories that underlie it in each case, and with its intellectual sources in the writings of such figures as Marx and Keynes and Robinson and Chamberlain. The role of Marx is especially noteworthy. His exploitation theory underlies the assumption that interventionism has no cost to anyone but the capitalist exploiters, in quotes, that it somehow just comes out of surplus value or profits. And this notion, of course, is powerfully reinforced by the government's ability to create money, which, as I explained in my lecture on money, makes its expenditures appear costless to the citizens. Well, perhaps someday some of you may be inspired to organize or participate in such a project. The ultimate goal, of course, would be nothing less than the elimination of all government intervention, and thereby the achievement of a fully free and far more rapidly progressing and prosperous society. And if so, the most important and essential preparation you can make for such a project is to read and study the works of Ludwig von Mises. Well, now what I would like you to do, I've basically finished what I wanted to be sure to say to you. What I'd like you to do, what I've in effect done, is given you a kind of immediate problem-solving type assignment. I'd like you to read the article on the poor that appeared in the New York Times this last July 30th, less than 2 weeks ago, by Bob Herbert, who's a regular contributor to the Times. And the article presents a typical leftist slant on poverty and the solution for it. And after you read it, which shouldn't take more than 5 minutes, I'd like you to think about what could actually be done to alleviate the kind of poverty he describes, but not by means of more government intervention, rather instead by means of reducing or abolishing existing government intervention and correspondingly enlarging the sphere of economic freedom. See, the leftists keep pointing to problems, and sometimes these are very sad problems, and they evoke your sympathies. I read this article, and I couldn't help feeling very sorry for the plight of the woman described. And the usual knee-jerk reaction is, well, now we have to have more government programs, raise the minimum wage further, do one thing after another. I'd like you instead to think, and you might continue to think about this without any fixed limit in time, what could be done in the way of repealing government intervention? What is the government doing to create the kind of poverty that's being described, and what should it stop doing to alleviate that poverty? And you could think of it in terms of one aspect would be, what could the government stop doing that it now does that would make it possible for low-paid workers to earn more than they currently earn, or keep more of their earnings than they currently keep? And also, what else might be done in terms of eliminating or just reducing government intervention that would make the housing they have to buy and the prices they have to pay in general, make all of those things more affordable. So, I ask you to turn to that, and then we'll hear from you and see what you come up with. So thank you. All right, here we are. We have this woman who's working at $6 and $7 an hour jobs. And the first category of question, I think, is what could be done in the way of reducing or abolishing existing government intervention that would make it possible for people in that position to earn more money. Yes?
I think the first thing to do would be to abolish pocket taxes, because I think they just afford the work, and the returns they're getting for them.
Yeah. The FICA taxes, that's the Social Security taxes, and then there's the Medicare taxes. And the combined amount of that tax, you have to realize, that what's relevant is not just what the wage earner himself directly pays, which I think is 7.75%. There's some limit. I don't know where the limit is. It keeps rising. Maybe it's 70-something thousand a year now. But certainly people in that low income category, they're paying the tax on their full earnings. And plus, you have to realize that the employer's contribution is really indirectly at the expense of the employee. The employer has to pay a matching 7.75%, and that means the total take is 15.5%. It makes no difference to the employer whether he's paying an additional 7.75% to the government on account of the wage earner he employs, or if he were to pay it instead directly to the wage earner. His work would be a little simpler if he could pay it to the wage earner. So let's just assume that to help people in this unfortunate position, imagine we had an intelligent, pro-economic freedom representation in Congress, or any intelligent, articulate group out there arguing, and they have a new campaign, a new program. They want to help people in this position. Well, if we can't immediately totally abolish the Social Security program, why not at least make it voluntary for people whose earnings are below the government's own poverty line? Let them have the option. Do they want to semi-starve now to contribute for many, many years later? Or would they be better off keeping their own incomes? Well, that would be an immediate rise in income. It would amount to something more than 15.5%, because it would be added to a base that's already lower by 15.5%. So that would be very helpful. Yes?
For housing, eliminate regulation on building and regulation on land for building, and eliminate the rent control.
Okay, with housing, certainly, and now that's turning to the second half of the problem, the cost of living element. And you're making the very legitimate point. There are all kinds of housing regulations that drive up costs. Now, the government thinks that all it has to do is impose regulations to make conditions better in housing. And so the government, and it may be more an issue of local ordinances rather than federal legislation, but you can't be sure today. There are all kinds of regulations that may mandate the minimum square footage that an apartment has to contain, or the minimum amount of wall space devoted to windows, regulations of that kind. Now, the government thinks it's simply improving things, but what is the effect of the cost of those regulations on the provision of housing? Well, it's making it higher. And the government has regulations concerning such issues as unrelated adults sharing the same living quarters. And, of course, there's zoning laws which artificially and substantially increase the land cost per unit of building. There are safety codes. Now, if you came out and said simply, let's abolish safety codes, well, you'd evoke horror, and I don't think you can get it through. But suppose, while that's your ultimate goal, you don't have to aim to get your ultimate goal through immediately. Suppose we just we wanted to eliminate the marginal 25% of cost imposed by building codes and safety codes. So just get rid of those that add the least safety relative to the cost. That could certainly be done, and that would serve to lower costs. And let me just point out here, try to imagine who would be affected if the government imposed a regulation saying, we will not allow any old, dirty automobiles on our wonderful public highways. No car is allowed to cruise a federal highway that is more than 10 years old. Because we want to have a better-looking class of cars on our nice freeways, especially since we got rid of the ugly advertising signs. Let's spruce up the cars, too. Well, who will be negatively affected by that? the poor. What we're doing is we're setting a minimum level of quality too high for the poor to afford. Well, that's what goes on with the housing regulations. The government, there's a point in the article, poor people can't afford any kind of apartment. Well, the reason that many of them can't, they could afford something, but the government is pricing the lowest types of units available beyond the reach of this category of poor people. And if they stop doing that, well, you and I might not want to live in the kinds of places these people would live in. They would still be able to live in better conditions than they now do. So that would be significant. Yes, Dr. Stromberg.
Well, it's interesting, this comment that the roof or dirty split.
I'm sorry?
The roof or the dirty split.
Yeah.
We couldn't afford that. Well, I think that the whole question of health is the medical market structure and why prescription drugs cost what they cost. And it's something else that I want to think in this article.
Mm-hmm, right.
The whole really regulated market and cartel effect and so forth.
Yes, and the fact that you have everything has to be a prescription, and you have to have the pharmacist whose job is more often than not taking pills from a large bottle and putting them into a small bottle, and that adds substantially to the cost. Well, again, as even before you establish the general principle, as a special emergency measure to help people in this situation, at least make certain common categories of antibiotics available on a non-prescription basis. That would be very helpful. And then also, closely related to making Social Security voluntary, at least for people in this position, to whatever extent any of them may have medical insurance coverage, give them the option of getting that money paid to them in cash, tax-free as it now is to the employer, at their option. And then you might say, well, how do we help out these people with their medical problems? Now they just don't have any insurance at all. Many of them don't have it to begin with. Well, I think to deal with the medical problems of low-income people, we could have a special relaxation of government controls and regulations for them. Why not, for example, today we have insane malpractice suits going on, which didn't always exist. They're the product of something that's happened in the last couple of generations. Why not make it possible for clinics to exist that would be subject to the malpractice laws and court precedents and whatever that existed prior to some cutoff year, perhaps 1950, when the situation was more reasonable. Why not also to cope with the medical problems of people who have no insurance? If you stop to think, what is the cost of a hospital room? It's astronomical. I imagine by now, in many places, it will cost $2,000 a night. And getting a pair of Tylenol tablets delivered to your room, that may be a $25 charge. Well, if you stop to think, what does it cost to stay at a fairly nice first-class hotel? Well, $100, $200? Now imagine you add to that round-the-clock nursing care with the nurses perhaps spread over 6 or 8 patients. And you start looking at what are the costs of providing medical services, not to deal with the most advanced, complicated situations, but many, many routine matters, appendectomies, pneumonia, things of this kind. If you look at the incredible rates being charged and the actual costs of providing them, there's a tremendous profit margin there, certainly if you eliminate all of the unnecessary costs imposed by the government, all of the paperwork costs, the provision against malpractice and whatever. But what would happen if we could make at least clinics and hospitals catering to uninsured people, which would include so many of these low-income people, and who could then have the option, if they had insurance, to get rid of it and increase their take-home incomes to that extent. Suppose we said that for such people, any 3 doctors who are already licensed by the state, they have enough licensing, any 3 doctors who want to can open their own hospital or clinic and treat such cases as they feel competent to treat. Well, wouldn't there be a tremendous profit incentive to do that? Well, what would be the effect once we started having some new hospitals and clinics opened to cash in on these high profits? The prices would drop until the point was that they covered just the cost plus enough profit to provide a competitive rate of profit. And then those hospitals and clinics that wanted to be exceptionally profitable, they'd have to find ways to become more efficient, cut the costs further. We'd be getting the benefit of economic progress in medicine. We'd have a major reduction in medical costs for the poor and, of course, for everybody if we would then broaden the availability. So, yes, Mr. England?
Housing is very much a large expense for anybody, a mortgage or a realtor, whatever. I go back when my mom and dad bought their house in Spokane, Washington for $12,500 in 1965.
1965, yeah.
Today, that same house, they still live in it, would be about $150,000. A lot of people can't afford that.
Right.
And as we discussed yesterday in monetary reform, that goes back to the hidden cost of inflation and the hyper-unreality of that cost in the real estate market. So a large solution is to limit inflation for things like some gold standard. And that's something, maybe that's too broad, but I think that's something that will really address a lot of these issues right here.
Well, eliminating inflation would certainly prevent the rise in price, but we also have to recognize that inflation is raising the wages of most people. So the inflation by itself, I don't think, in the long run would account not directly for housing becoming more expensive, to the extent that it undermines savings, to the extent that it undermines the availability of funds available to finance mortgages, drives up interest rates, then it's adding to the cost. To the extent that you have tighter and tighter building codes, safety codes, more zoning regulation, to the extent that the government is doing things that directly or indirectly drive up the costs of construction materials, to whatever extent construction unions might get more influence, or unions in the production of construction materials, that would do it. Property taxes can add to it. Zoning regulations, removing land from development. In Southern California, we have such a thing as the Coastal Commission, and it takes broad swaths of land off the market for possible development. It makes land scarcer, more expensive. Zoning does the same thing. So there's a lot along those lines. This gentleman here.
The government can stop intervening into agriculture and stop paying farmers not to sell their wheat or sell their corn.
Exactly. That's a very good point. The government makes the price of many foodstuffs artificially high by paying farmers not to plant, by buying up enough of their output deliberately to maintain a higher price. It's imposing higher food costs on the poor in that way. So that's a significant element. And then also let me point out, in connection with the wage rates at the bottom of the ladder, to the extent that there is pro-union legislation and the labor unions are able to raise wage rates higher up the scale for skilled workers, for semi-skilled workers, for people who are earning substantially more than $6 or $7 an hour, indirectly that serves to reduce wage rates at the bottom of the scale. Now, how does it do that? Well, what is the effect on the number of people who can be employed, let's say in any skilled capacity, if the wage rate for their category of work is artificially increased? Okay, there are fewer people. If the carpenters' union succeeds in driving up the wage rates of carpenters, fewer carpenters can be employed. Now you have to remember, incidentally, that the influence of the unions extends far beyond the ranks of far beyond the unionized companies. today, labor union membership is perhaps 13% of the American labor force, roughly, something like that. But that doesn't mean that the labor unions artificially raise the wage rates only of 13% of the workers. Because there are many, many companies that are willing to match the union scales in order to be able to tell their workers, you're earning just as much now as you could by belonging to a union, and you don't have to pay union dues either, so you have no reason to join a union. Now, why do the companies want to do that? Well, because their workers could fairly easily unionize if they wanted to, and if they did, then the companies would not only have to pay them the union scales, but also contend with all of the union work rules and inefficiencies. So they suffer much less just by matching the union scales. But those higher union scales operate to cause a smaller quantity of labor demanded quite extensively at the skilled and semi-skilled level. Well, what happens to skilled workers who can't find the jobs they otherwise would have had the unions not raised their category of wage rate? Okay, they'll look for other jobs, second choice jobs, not as good jobs. There's now a larger supply of labor competing for jobs somewhat further down in the labor market. Now, to the extent that they'll be employed there, well, there are two possibilities. If there's no union involvement in the lower area, what happens to wage rates in those jobs? Yes?
Eliminate tariffs.
No, that's another solution. I'm asking what happens when you have workers displaced from higher skilled jobs through artificially high union wage rates. Well, one possible consequence is if they're flowing into labor markets where the unions are not have no influence, then wage rates would simply be lower. But let's suppose those lesser jobs, they're also dominated by union scales. Well, then the more skilled, better workers, they may end up being employed, but then they bump out, in effect, less capable workers who can't find work. And where do those workers have to go? To other lower jobs. So the problem ends up being concentrated at the bottom. We have the spillover from the higher paying fields into the lower paying fields, and it all ends up concentrating at the bottom. Now, if we had no minimum wage law, you could have full employment, but the full pressure would be on the wage rates at the bottom of the scale. You'd be asking a limited number of unskilled jobs. Their wage rates would have to go so low as to be able to absorb this spillover of workers forced out of employment higher up the scale. Well, suppose we want to make it possible to have full employment at the bottom of the scale, but at a better level of wage rates. What do we need to do to make it possible to have the best possible level of wage rates at the bottom of the scale?
Eliminate the NLRB?
Yeah, eliminate the pro-union legislation higher up the scale. Not only eliminate such things as minimum wage laws, but at the same time, pro-union legislation. Yes?
There is even the Davis-Bacon wage law, where on federal construction projects, a worker will get $24 per hour. There is that too. And that's a direct federal government mandate. So it's right there.
The federal government is mandating that on all federal construction projects, the workers get the union scale.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that would be a feature that would have to be eliminated. Now, so this gentleman here mentioned tariffs. That's another thing that operates from the side of the cost of living. Eliminating that would lower costs and make life easier for people at the bottom of the ladder also. Now, you may notice in that article, there was a line, the woman said there was one place where she was almost able to make ends meet when she was living in Portland, Maine, I guess. But she said she was only able to do that by virtue of working 7 days. Now that's a very unpleasant situation to be in. I know if I had to work 7 days a week, on a regular basis, not just once in a great while, I'd feel like I was never able to get my head up for air. And I imagine most people would feel that way. But there is something significant buried here, and that is one solution to being able to earn more money when you're in desperate need is to be able to do more work. Now, it doesn't have to be a 7-day week, but what about the ability to work a 5-day week at 10 hours a day? Or a 6-day week at 8 hours? That would represent a substantial improvement on the order of 20 to 25%. Well, what stands in the way of that? Laws requiring that overtime have, I believe, a 50% or perhaps an even higher premium. Well, yes.
Or even the Sunday rule that people are not allowed to work on Sundays, and could prevent that people who are willing to work more than that, even if firms are prepared to employ the people on Sundays, both parties could engage in some mutual contract, but the regulations don't allow them to.
Right. Now, I'm not familiar with specific Sunday regulations. Maybe they exist in various localities. I don't know. You may know more about it than I do. I know where I live in Southern California, most retail establishments, all department stores, they're open 7 days a week. I don't know if it's the case that they pay people more on Sundays or are mandated to, but maybe so. But in any case, we have laws deliberately designed to prevent people from working more than a 40-hour week. Now, it's certainly preferable to work just 40 hours than 48 or 50 hours if you can afford to do so and that's what you want to do. But there are circumstances in which many people cannot afford to do so, where their need for income outweighs their need for that leisure, and the government is preventing them from earning that additional income. Yes, sir.
Not only that, though, sometimes you'll have places that will have overtime for employees, and by running more employees doing overtime versus hiring new people at part-time rates in terms of benefits,
Yeah.
It's actually cheaper to run them on overtime.
Now, if you have to add additional payroll taxes and so on.
So that keeps people out of the market who may be able to pick up a part-time job.
All right, well, that can keep people out of the market for part-time jobs, that's true. But also, the law, there are many cases where firms are not employing people overtime. If they have a regular need for more people, they'll have an extra shift. But there are many cases where they would employ people for longer hours if the law didn't weight things against doing so by requiring a certain minimum premium, a substantial minimum premium for employing people longer hours. So the law is in effect preventing this woman who is barely able to make conditions meet in Portland, working presumably 56 hours a week, 7 days a week. They're preventing her from being able to work longer hours per day, preventing other people from doing it instead of having to work 7 days. If she were able to work a 10-hour day, 5 days a week, or conceivably, if it's bad enough, 6 days a week, she would be able to make it more easily than the situation she's in. So, if you couldn't get the government to abolish the maximum hours laws in toto right away, it would be a good point to argue that at least in the case of workers below the poverty line, or some percentage below some percentage above the poverty line, that there should be no restrictions on hours for them. That the maximum hours laws should not apply in their case. Let's say to people making less than $30,000 a year or whatever, they should be able to negotiate whatever they want. And then there's another point in that article. Yes?
That is, I read that the woman cannot afford to buy shoes and clothes. Because I saw in the American stores that clothes are more expensive than in Europe, for example. I believe that there are many regulations or many tariffs about clothes in America. If Americans can buy clothes and shoes at European or Latin American prices, this woman can afford shoes and at the same level of quality.
Yeah, there are definitely things. Tariffs are certainly something that keep up the prices. Okay, one last quick point. You may notice somewhere in the article it stated, if you have a child, there's no way you can make it. Well, can you think of any last measure that would at least alleviate that problem? Well, what about letting children do some work? Now, that's something horrifying to most people, but what if children, let's say at the age of 12, were allowed to do certain types of jobs? And I have to tell you, when I was 8 years old, not for very long, but only for a few days, I wasn't allowed to continue. I sold newspapers. And this was a long time ago, in 1945. And a newspaper was selling for 5 cents in Miami, Florida. And I got 2 cents out of the 5 cents for every paper I sold. And at the end of the day, my jeans pocket was bulging with coins. And I felt like I was really rich. I made almost $1. And the price of a movie admission was 8 cents. And so I was on Easy Street. Now, if you have poor families, perhaps the child labor laws should be relaxed in their case. Have a lower minimum working age. We don't have to start asking for the total immediate abolition, but let's have a minimum age of 12 instead of 16 or 18, or conceivably perhaps even 10. But that